Settle in now, the fire is low, the night is deep, and the world outside has faded to a gentle hum. Tonight, we turn our attention to one of the most celebrated, most complex, and perhaps most contradictory figures in all of Greek mythology. A god who embodied perfection in form and face, who wielded both healing touch and deadly arrow, who brought clarity through prophecy, yet left hearts shattered in his wake. Tonight we speak of Apollo, the radiant one, the far shooter, the god of so very many things that to list them all might take until dawn. But before we begin our journey properly, take a moment to press that like button if you're enjoying these mythological wanderings, and do subscribe if you haven't already. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is in your corner of the world. I'm always fascinated to see who's joining us on these late-night explorations of the ancient world. Now then, pull your blanket a little closer, perhaps adjust your pillow, and let's step back through the mists of time to when gods walked among mortals, and the line between the divine and the earthly was gossamer thin, Apollo. Even his name seems to shimmer with authority. He was god of the sun, though not originally so, that honor belonging to Helios before the two became conflated in later tradition. He was god of music, his lyre producing sounds so divine that even the muses themselves would pause to listen. He was god of prophecy, speaking the will of Zeus through his Oracle at Delphi, the most famous and influential religious site in all of ancient Greece. He was god of healing, yes, but also of plague, because the ancient Greeks understood that the power to cure and the power to harm were often two sides of the same coin. He was god of archery, of poetry, of truth, of light itself. The Greeks saw in Apollo the embodiment of ideal masculine beauty. Young, athletic, beardless in the style of the Kouros, forever captured in that perfect moment between boyhood and manhood. Artists rendered him in marble with features so flawless that even other gods reportedly felt a twinge of envy. Yet for all his physical perfection and divine gifts, Apollo's story is anything but perfect. His loves ended in tragedy. His temper could be swift and merciless. His pride led him into conflicts that rippled across generations. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Every story must begin somewhere, and Apollo's begins, like so many divine tales, with Zeus and one of his many, many romantic entanglements that did not involve his wife. Leto was her name, a Titaness, daughter of Chaos and Phoebe, blessed with beauty that eventually caught the roving eye of the king of gods. And Zeus, as was his habit, pursued her with all the subtlety of a thunderstorm. Leto, flattered or perhaps simply unable to refuse the Lord of Olympus, became pregnant. Not with one child, mind you, but with twins. And this is where her troubles truly began. Hera, Zeus's wife and queen of the gods, had long since developed a rather impressive tolerance for her husband's infidelities. Tolerance, however, is not the same as approval, and Hera's jealousy when provoked could make natural disasters look mild by comparison. When she learned that Leto carried Zeus's children, twins no less, her fury knew no bounds. Hera issued a decree that spread across the ancient world like wildfire. No land, no island, no place where the sun touched earth would be permitted to offer Leto shelter when her time came to give birth. Imagine, if you will, a pregnant woman, belly swollen with divine children, wandering from place to place seeking only a safe spot to deliver her babies. Everywhere she went, she was turned away. Cities closed their gates. Islands literally turned their backs to her. Some stories say that Hera sent the monstrous serpent Python to pursue Leto relentlessly, adding physical threat to her isolation. Others tell that Hera held back Eileithyia, the goddess of childbirth, to make Leto's labor as prolonged and agonizing as possible. For months, Leto wandered. Her desperation grew. The twins within her waited. Divine children denied their entry into the world by the spite of a jealous goddess. And then, at last, she came to Delos. Delos was no grand island. It was small, rocky, barren, and by most accounts floating. Yes, floating, untethered to the ocean floor, and therefore not technically part of the earth. This loophole, this tiny crack in Hera's curse, was enough. The island, taking pity on Leto, or perhaps seeing opportunity in hosting the birth of Zeus's children, agreed to provide sanctuary. Leto promised that her son would honor Delos above all places, that magnificent temples would rise there, that pilgrims would come from across the world. The island, which had nothing and was nothing in the grand scheme of Greek geography, accepted. The labor was long, 9 days and 9 nights, some accounts say, because Hera had indeed detained Eileithyia. The other goddesses who had gathered to help sent Iris, the rainbow messenger, with a bribe, a necklace of gold and amber. Only when Eileithyia arrived did Leto's suffering finally reach its conclusion. Clinging to a palm tree or an olive tree, sources differ on that particular detail, she first gave birth to Artemis. And then, with her newborn daughter's help, yes, her just-born daughter helping with the delivery, Leto brought forth Apollo. The child emerged perfect. Golden-haired, radiant, already beautiful beyond mortal comprehension. The goddesses wrapped him in white swaddling and fed him nectar and ambrosia, the food of the gods. And then something extraordinary happened. Apollo, mere moments old, threw off his swaddling clothes and stood as a fully grown god, tall and radiant and ready to claim his place among the Olympians. His first words, according to the Homeric hymn, were a declaration of his domains. "The lyre and the curved bow shall ever be dear to me," he announced, "and I will declare to men the unfailing will of Zeus." Just like that, born from impossible circumstances, Apollo entered the world not as a helpless infant, but as a god in full possession of his power and purpose. Delos, true to its agreement, became sacred to him, one of the most important cult sites in ancient Greece. And Apollo, only days old in the telling, was ready for his first great deed. The serpent Python was old. Older than the Olympians, a child of Gaia herself, the primordial earth. This creature, sometimes described as a dragon, sometimes as a massive snake, made its lair at Pytho, a place that would later be known as Delphi. There, coiled near the sacred spring, Python guarded the ancient oracle that had once belonged to the earth goddess Gaia, and before her perhaps to Themis. Picture this beast, if you will. Scales thick as shields, each one reflecting centuries of existence, eyes that had watched civilizations rise and crumble, a body so massive that when it moved, the earth trembled. Its breath was said to carry disease, its venom capable of corrupting entire water sources, making them undrinkable for generations. Local shepherds whispered stories of Python to keep children from wandering too far. Travelers took long detours to avoid the mountain where the serpent dwelled. Even other monsters gave Python a wide berth, recognizing something primal and terrible in its nature. Why did Apollo decide to confront this beast? The reasons vary depending on who's telling the story. Some say Python had pursued his mother Leto during her pregnancy, acting as Hera's agent of persecution, and Apollo sought vengeance. The young god, though barely born in some tellings, some sources say merely days old, others depict him as slightly older, possessed memory beyond mortal understanding and knew what his mother had suffered. He knew how she had wandered, belly swollen with him and his sister, finding rejection at every shore. He knew that Python had been part of that persecution, slithering after her with jaws wide and hunger in its ancient eyes. Revenge, then, was one motivation, the settling of a debt incurred before he was even born. Others claim the young god simply desired the oracle site for himself, recognizing its power and prestige. Delphi, even before it was Delphi, sat at the navel of the world, the omphalos, the center point where Earth's energies converged. Controlling such a place meant controlling prophecy itself, meant becoming the voice through which mortals heard divine will. For a god establishing his place in the pantheon, particularly one whose domains included prophecy and truth, claiming Delphi was strategic necessity. Still others suggest it was a necessary act, that Python terrorized the region, poisoning waters and devouring livestock and people alike. Villages lived in fear. Farmers abandoned their fields. The land around Pytho had become a wasteland, corrupted by the serpent's mere presence. Someone had to act, and the other gods, for whatever reasons, had not. Perhaps they feared Python. Perhaps they simply didn't care about the mortal suffering. But Apollo, new to his divine role, saw an opportunity to prove himself, to demonstrate that he was not merely beautiful and talented, but also brave and willing to face genuine danger. Perhaps the truth involves all three. Apollo was complex enough to contain multiple motivations simultaneously. He could seek vengeance while also pursuing power, while also genuinely wanting to help those suffering under Python's shadow. The Greeks understood that purity of motive was rare, that most significant actions arose from tangled combinations of self-interest and altruism, pride and compassion. What we know is that Apollo, only 4 days old but already a god in his prime, took up his bow. This was no ordinary weapon. It had been crafted for him by Hephaestus, the divine smith, commissioned by Zeus himself. Silver it was, or gold, depending on the source, and its arrows flew with perfect accuracy, carrying with them both the promise of swift death and the certainty of divine judgment. Each arrow was a masterwork, fletched with the feathers of sacred birds, tipped with points that could pierce even divine flesh should the need arise. Apollo climbed Mount Parnassus, where Python dwelled. The ascent itself was treacherous. The path, such as it was, wound through regions where Python's influence had corrupted the natural order. Trees grew twisted, their bark weeping a substance that smelled of decay. Streams ran black with contamination. The very air seemed thick, resistant, as though the mountain itself tried to repel this young intruder. But Apollo was the god of light, and darkness could not ultimately bar his way. With each step he took, the corruption seemed to pull back slightly, as though recognizing something it could not overcome. The confrontation, when it came, began not with violence but with words. Python, sensing the approach of divine power, raised its massive head from the coiled rest of its body. Its eyes, ancient and knowing, regarded Apollo with something that might have been curiosity or contempt, or perhaps a mixture of both. "You are young." Python's voice was like stones grinding together, like the earth itself speaking. "And you do not understand what you attempt. I am older than your father. I was here before Olympus rose, I will be here when it falls." Apollo drew his bow. "You pursued my mother. You terrorized these lands. Your time ends now." "Does it?" Python seemed almost amused. "Many have come before you, young god. Warriors, heroes, other divine beings seeking glory. I have consumed them all. Their bones lie scattered in my lair, their names forgotten. What makes you think you will fare any better?" "Because I am Apollo," he replied simply, "and I do not miss." The battle erupted in an instant. Python struck first, its massive body uncoiling with terrifying speed. The serpent was fast, despite its size, faster than anything its bulk should allow. Jaws wide enough to swallow a horse whole snapped at Apollo, venom dripping from fangs the length of swords. But Apollo was faster still. He dodged, rolled, his divine reflexes turning the serpent's attacks into mere near misses. And then he began to shoot. The first arrow struck Python's scales near the head. The impact sounded like a hammer on an anvil, but the arrow penetrated, drawing first blood. Python roared, a sound that shook the mountain, that sent rocks tumbling from higher peaks, that made distant villagers cover their ears and pray for deliverance. Apollo shot again, and again and again. Each arrow found its mark. Some pierced the great scales, others found the softer places between them. One struck Python's eye, and the serpent's roar became a shriek of genuine pain. It thrashed, trying to crush Apollo beneath its coils, trying to retreat into its lair, trying anything to escape this relentless assault. The arrows kept coming. 100. 200. Some accounts say 1,000 arrows found their mark before Python finally fell. The serpent's blood, dark and ancient, spilled across the rocks, and wherever it touched, the ground itself seemed to sicken and die. But the corruption was temporary, for Apollo's light was already beginning to cleanse what Python's death had spoiled. Python thrashed and screamed, a sound that echoed through the mountains. Its blood, dark and ancient, spilled across the rocks, and as the creature died, Apollo is said to have shouted at it, "Rot now upon the soil that feeds men. You shall not live to be an evil bane to the living." And from this command came one of the etymologies suggested for the name Pytho, from the Greek word pythein, meaning to rot. As the serpent's death throes finally ceased, as the great body lay still at last, Apollo stood victorious. But he did not smile. He did not celebrate. He looked down at what he had killed and felt, perhaps for the first time, the weight of taking a life, even a monstrous one. Python had been terrible, yes, but also ancient, a relic of an earlier age. In killing it, Apollo had ended something that could never be replaced, had severed a thread that connected back to the very beginning of the world. The victory established Apollo as a god to be reckoned with. But there were consequences. Python was Gaia's child, and even gods must answer for kinslaying. Apollo was required to undergo purification to atone for the death. Zeus instituted the Pythian Games as part of this purification process, athletic and musical competitions held in Apollo's honor that would rival even the Olympics in importance. Through these rituals, Apollo's deed was sanctified, and he claimed the oracle site for himself. But more importantly, Apollo claimed the oracle site. He established his sanctuary at Delphi, renaming the location from its ancient name of Pytho. He dedicated a tripod to the shrine, a three-legged stand that became one of his most recognizable symbols. Upon this tripod would sit the Pythia, his priestess, who would deliver his prophecies in a trance state, speaking words that were then interpreted by priests into the cryptic verses that guided Greek civilization for over 1,000 years. The Oracle of Delphi became the most important religious institution in ancient Greece. Kings consulted it before going to war. City-states sought its guidance on matters of law and colonization. Individuals came seeking answers about their futures, their families, their fates. The Pythia, always a woman, always over 50 years of age, would sit on the sacred tripod in the inner sanctum, the adyton, breathing in vapors that rose from a chasm in the earth. Whether these vapors were literally intoxicating gases or metaphorical divine inspiration remains debated even today, but their effect was real enough to the ancient Greeks. And Apollo, through his oracle, became the voice of Zeus on earth, the interpreter of divine will, the god who made the future known to those brave enough to ask and wise enough to properly interpret the riddling responses. His epithet, Loxius, meaning the ambiguous one, or the oblique, referenced the famously cryptic nature of Delphic prophecies. Kings have fallen because they misunderstood Apollo's words, hearing what they wished to hear rather than what was actually said. Python's death gave Apollo power, prestige, and a center of worship that would endure for centuries. The god of light had claimed his place as one of the most influential deities in the Greek pantheon, establishing himself as a force to be reckoned with from his earliest days. But the bow, deadly as it was only half of Apollo's gifts. The other half arrived in a far more amusing fashion, delivered by the least likely courier, a baby god with a talent for mischief and an eye for cattle. Hermes was born in the morning, played the lyre by midday, and stole Apollo's sacred cattle by evening. This should tell you everything you need to know about the messenger god's character from the very beginning. Maia, his mother, had given birth to him in a cave on Mount Selene, and the infant, rather than crying for milk or cooing at his mother, immediately began plotting grand larceny. He spotted a tortoise outside the cave. Most babies might have found this creature fascinating in a simple, innocent way. Hermes looked at it and saw an opportunity. He killed the tortoise, not out of cruelty, but practicality, and scooped out its shell. Then he took some of Apollo's sacred cattle. Yes, he hadn't stolen them yet, but we're getting ahead of the chronology here. Excuse me, he prepared materials in advance, shall we say. Using sinews from cattle as strings and adding arms made from curved horns, Hermes created the first lyre, a musical instrument whose sound was so sweet that even the gods would weep to hear it. Now then, the cattle. Apollo possessed a herd of magnificent white cattle, sacred animals that grazed in the groves of Pieria. These were no ordinary cows. They were divine, beautiful, and very much Apollo's pride and joy. Hermes, that same evening of his birth, decided he wanted them. The fact that they belonged to his far more powerful half-brother did not deter him in the slightest. Under cover of darkness, Hermes drove 50 of the cattle away from their grazing grounds. But here's where his cleverness truly shone. He made the cattle walk backwards, and he himself walked in unusual shoes made of bark and twigs, creating confusing tracks that led nowhere discernible. When Apollo, in his role as the god who sees all, noticed his missing herd the next morning, he found tracks that suggested the cattle had walked toward their meadow rather than away from it, and that the thief had feet unlike any creature known to gods or men. Apollo, using his prophetic powers, eventually tracked the theft to Hermes' cave. He stormed in, furious, demanding the return of his property. And there was Hermes, lying in his cradle, swaddled like an innocent babe, looking up at Apollo with eyes that radiated pure innocence. "Cattle," he seemed to say without words. "What cattle? I'm just a baby. I was born yesterday. How could a newborn possibly steal anything, let alone sacred cows?" Apollo was not amused. He grabbed the infant and hauled him straight to Olympus for Zeus to judge. The king of gods, hearing both sides of the accusation, tried very hard not to laugh. Here was his youngest son, barely a day old, accused of cattle rustling by his older son, the archer god who had just killed a dragon. Zeus demanded the truth, and Hermes, with theatrical reluctance, admitted he might have borrowed the cattle. Just borrowed. Temporarily. He'd planned to return them, eventually. But then, as Apollo prepared to drag his brother and the cattle back to Pieria, Hermes pulled out the lyre. He began to play. The sound that emerged was unlike anything heard before. Strings vibrated with harmonies that seemed to echo the music of the spheres themselves. The melody was sweet and wild and melancholy and joyful all at once, capturing something essential about existence that could only be expressed through music. Apollo, who had been angry mere moments before, froze. His rage melted. His eyes widened. He felt his divine heart stirred by something he had never experienced. "Where did you get that?" Apollo demanded, but his tone had changed entirely. "How do you make it produce such sounds?" Hermes, sensing victory, offered a trade. He would give Apollo the lyre, this magnificent new instrument, in exchange for keeping the cattle. Additionally, Apollo would make Hermes the god of herdsmen, essentially legitimizing his theft into a divine portfolio. Apollo, completely enamored with the lyre, agreed without hesitation. He took the instrument, placed it in his hands, and began to play. And when Apollo played, even Hermes's music seemed like a child's first attempt by comparison. From that moment forward, the lyre became Apollo's signature instrument. He became the leader of the Muses, the 9 goddesses of artistic inspiration, and his music was said to maintain the harmony of the cosmos itself. When Apollo played, stones would weep, trees would dance, and even the most hardened warrior would feel tears upon his cheeks. The god who brought light to the world now also brought music, and the two gifts intertwined in him, inseparable aspects of his divine nature. But Apollo's supremacy in music was not unchallenged. The pastoral god Pan, he of the pipes and goat legs and wild nature, grew proud of his own musical abilities. Pan played the syrinx, a set of reed pipes that produced a rustic, earthy sound beloved by shepherds and woodland creatures. And Pan, in a moment of spectacular hubris, challenged Apollo to a musical contest. The two gods chose Mount Tmolus to serve as their judge. Tmolus was himself a mountain god, ancient and supposedly wise enough to arbitrate fairly. Also present was King Midas of Phrygia, that same Midas who would later receive the Golden Touch, but at this time was simply a devotee of Pan and a lover of pastoral music. Pan went first. He played his pipes, and the music was wild and free, full of the spirit of the forests and fields. Birds flew closer to hear. Squirrels emerged from their holes. The trees themselves seemed to sway in time with the melody. It was good music, no question, perfectly suited to Pan's domain and nature. Then Apollo lifted his lyre. The music that followed was divine in every sense of the word. It was the sound of sunlight on water, of stars wheeling through the heavens, of perfect mathematical harmonies expressed through vibrating strings. Everything stopped moving, not from fear but from awe. The very air held its breath. Tmolus and all others present understood immediately that they were hearing something beyond mortal or even most immortal comprehension. When the music ended, Tmolus declared Apollo the clear winner. Everyone agreed, everyone nodded in acknowledgement of the sun god's superiority. Everyone, that is, except King Midas. The mortal king, either from genuine love of Pan's simpler music, or from sheer stubbornness, or perhaps from a fundamental lack of good sense, protested. He claimed Pan should have won, that Apollo's music, while technically proficient, lacked the earthiness and authenticity of Pan's pipes. Apollo stared at Midas for a long moment. Then, with the casual cruelty that gods sometimes displayed toward mortals who offended them, he changed Midas's ears into those of a donkey. Large, floppy, unmistakably asinine ears that broadcast to anyone who saw them that their owner was a fool. Midas tried to hide them under a turban, but his barber knew, and barbers cannot keep secrets. The story of King Midas's donkey ears became a cautionary tale about questioning divine judgment. But Pan's challenge was merely foolish. Another challenge to Apollo's musical supremacy was genuinely offensive and ended far more brutally. Marsyas was a satyr, half man and half beast, who found a flute that had been discarded by Athena. The goddess had invented the instrument, but threw it away when she saw how playing it puffed up her cheeks in an unflattering manner. The flute, however, came with a curse. Athena had declared that whoever picked it up would suffer terribly. Marsyas either didn't know about the curse or didn't care. He picked up the flute and discovered he could make it produce extraordinary music. His skill grew. People flocked to hear him play. And Marsyas, drunk on praise and applause, made a catastrophic mistake. He challenged Apollo to a musical contest, claiming he was the superior musician. Apollo accepted, but he added a condition. The winner would be able to do whatever he wished to the loser. Marsyas, confident in his abilities, agreed. The Muses were called to judge. Apollo played his lyre. Marsyas played his flute. Both performances were magnificent. The Muses could not initially decide between them. Then Apollo proposed a new challenge. Both would play their instruments upside down. Apollo simply inverted his lyre and continued playing. Marsyas could not blow into an upside-down flute. The Muses declared Apollo victorious. And Apollo, his pride wounded by the mere suggestion that a satyr could equal him, exercised his winner's privilege with horrifying cruelty. He had Marsyas tied to a tree and flayed alive, peeling the satyr's skin from his body while he still lived and screamed. The blood from this execution formed a river, and the tree to which Marsyas had been tied served as a grim reminder of the price of challenging a god's supremacy. This incident reveals something important about Apollo. For all his associations with reason, harmony, and civilization, he could be utterly merciless when his pride was touched. The god of light cast dark shadows, and those shadows fell heavily on anyone foolish enough to position themselves as his equal. The lyre remained his, undisputed, the symbol of his dominion over music and poetry and artistic inspiration. But the bow remained too, and that bow could bring either healing or death, depending on Apollo's mood and the circumstances. Which brings us to his next great domain, one of the most paradoxical aspects of his character: Apollo the healer, Apollo Alexikakos, the averter of evil, Apollo Paean, the physician. These were among his epithets, reflecting his role as a god of medicine and health. Yet this same god could send plagues with devastating efficiency. The Greeks understood this duality perfectly. The power to heal and the power to harm were simply two applications of the same divine force. The most famous example of Apollo's plague-bringing appears at the very beginning of Homer's Iliad. The Trojan War had been grinding on for 9 years. The Greek army besieged Troy, and among their captives was a young woman named Chryseis, daughter of Chryses, a priest of Apollo. The girl had been claimed as a war prize by Agamemnon, the leader of the Greek forces. Chryses came to the Greek camp bearing magnificent ransom for his daughter's return. He pleaded with Agamemnon, invoking Apollo's name, begging for compassion. Agamemnon, drunk on power and victory, not only refused, but insulted the old priest, threatening him if he dared return. Chryses, heartbroken and humiliated, walked back along the shore and prayed to Apollo for vengeance. Apollo heard his faithful priest's prayer, and his response was immediate and terrible. He descended from Olympus like nightfall, his face dark with anger, his silver bow across his shoulder. He came to the Greek camp and began shooting, not warriors first, but the pack animals, the mules and dogs. Then he turned his arrows on the men themselves. For 9 days, funeral pyres burned continuously in the Greek camp as soldiers died from Apollo's plague. Finally, Achilles called an assembly and demanded that Calchas, the seer, explain why the gods were angry. Calchas, terrified of Agamemnon's response, revealed the truth only after Achilles promised protection. The plague would not end until Chryseis was returned to her father without ransom and appropriate sacrifices made to Apollo. Agamemnon, furious at being forced to give up his prize, agreed but demanded compensation. He took Briseis, a captive who belonged to Achilles, sparking the legendary wrath of Achilles that drives the entire Iliad. But the plague ended. Apollo's arrows, which had brought death, fell silent once his priest was honored. This incident shows Apollo's capacity for both justice and destruction. He defended his priest, yes, but he did so by killing hundreds of men who had nothing to do with Chryseis's captivity. Divine justice, the Greeks understood, was not always proportionate or limited to the guilty party. But Apollo's greatest contribution to healing came through his son Asclepius. The story of Asclepius's birth is itself a tale of Apollo's volatility and love. The god fell in love with Coronis, a mortal princess of Thessaly. She became pregnant with his child, but while carrying Apollo's son, she fell in love with a mortal man named Ischys. A crow, white at the time and serving as Apollo's spy, reported her infidelity. Apollo's rage was immediate and total. He cursed the crow, turning its feathers black, a punishment that has affected all crows ever since. Then he sent Artemis, his twin sister, to kill Coronis with her arrows. As the faithless woman burned on her funeral pyre, Apollo suddenly regretted the severity of his vengeance. He rushed to the pyre and cut his unborn son from Coronis's womb, saving the child at the last possible moment. The baby was Asclepius. Apollo gave the infant to Chiron, the wise centaur who had trained countless heroes to raise and educate. Under Chiron's tutelage, Asclepius learned the arts of medicine, herbology, surgery, and healing. But he also inherited supernatural abilities from his divine father. Asclepius became so skilled that he could not only cure any disease, but could bring the dead back to life. According to various myths, Athena gave Asclepius 2 vials of Medusa's blood. One vial could kill, the other could resurrect. Asclepius began using his powers to restore the dead to life, reversing the most fundamental law of existence. He raised Glaucus, son of King Minos. He resurrected Tyndareus. He brought back Capaneus and Lycurgus. Each resurrection was a miracle, but also an offense against the natural order. Hades, lord of the underworld, grew alarmed. If mortals could escape death, his realm would empty. He complained to Zeus, arguing that Asclepius's actions threatened the balance between life and death, between mortals and immortals. Zeus, seeing the wisdom in this, took up one of his thunderbolts and struck Asclepius down, killing him instantly. Apollo, devastated by his son's death and enraged at Zeus, could not strike at the king of gods directly. Instead, he killed the Cyclopes, the master craftsman who forged Zeus's thunderbolts. This act of vengeance earned Apollo severe punishment. Zeus decreed that Apollo would be stripped of his divine privileges and forced to serve a mortal as a common laborer for an entire year. So Apollo found himself once again in servitude, this time to King Admetus of Phyrae in Thessaly. But Apollo, despite his reduced circumstances, served faithfully. He tended Admetus's cattle, even using his divine powers to make the herds multiply. The king, not knowing his humble cowherd was actually a god, treated Apollo with kindness and respect. When Apollo's year of service ended, he returned to Olympus, having learned, perhaps, something about humility and the value of honest work. As a reward for Admetus's fair treatment, Apollo later helped him win the hand of Alcestis and extended the king's life when it was time for him to die. But Asclepius was not forgotten. Zeus, recognizing the healer's pure intentions, if not agreeing with his methods, elevated Asclepius to divine status after death. He became the god of medicine, and his cult spread throughout Greece. Temples called Asclepioea were built in his honor, combining religious ritual with practical medicine. The most famous of these was at Epidaurus, where sick pilgrims would undergo purification rituals, make offerings, and then sleep in the temple, hoping for healing dreams sent by Asclepius. The symbol of Asclepius, a staff with a single serpent coiled around it, remains the symbol of medicine to this day. Snakes were associated with healing because they shed their skin and thus symbolized renewal and regeneration. The caduceus, sometimes confused with Asclepius's staff, actually belonged to Hermes and featured 2 snakes and wings, representing his role as messenger rather than healer. Through Asclepius, Apollo's healing legacy touched countless lives. But the god himself remained a paradox. He could cure with a touch or a prayer. He could also send plagues that devastated cities. His arrows carried both death and deliverance from suffering. This duality made him deeply feared and deeply revered, a god whose favor you wanted and whose anger you prayed to avoid. Apollo fell in love, often in fact, and with one notable exception involving his son Asclepius, these love affairs ended badly. Not slightly badly, catastrophically, tragically, mythically badly. The pattern repeated itself with such consistency that one might suspect Apollo had learned nothing from each successive heartbreak. But gods, unlike mortals, have the luxury of infinite time, and thus can make the same mistakes repeatedly without the inconvenience of aging or dying. The most famous of Apollo's love disasters involved a nymph named Daphne, and like so many Greek tragedies, it began with someone making fun of someone else at precisely the wrong moment. Apollo had just killed Python. He was riding high on his victory, confident in his prowess as an archer, perhaps a bit too pleased with himself. He was young, remember, only days or perhaps weeks old, depending on how you count divine time. He had proven himself capable of slaying a monster older than the current generation of gods. He had claimed Delphi as his own. He was establishing himself as a major deity, and that success had gone slightly to his head. He encountered Eros, the god of love, who was practicing with his own bow and arrows. Eros, despite being young and sometimes depicted as a cherubic child, wielded power that made even Zeus nervous. Love was not a minor force in Greek cosmology. It was fundamental, primordial, capable of toppling kingdoms and driving even the most rational minds to madness. Apollo, seeing what he assumed was a child playing with weapons, made a critical mistake. He mocked Eros. "What business does a child have with a warrior's weapons?" he reportedly said, or words to that effect. "Leave archery to those of us who have slain monsters. Stick to your love games and let real gods handle real weapons. That toy bow of yours is nothing compared to the weapon that felled Python." The words were careless, spoken from pride rather than malice, but they struck Eros like a slap. The young god's eyes narrowed. Eros smiled. It was not a friendly smile. It was the smile of someone who is about to teach a very powerful lesson to someone who desperately needs to learn it. The god of love had two types of arrows in his quiver. One was golden, tipped with the power to inspire overwhelming, all-consuming love, the kind of love that makes rational thought impossible, that reduces even gods to desperate pursuing shadows of themselves. The other was lead, carrying the opposite enchantment, the power to inspire complete and utter rejection of romantic advances, to make the very idea of love repulsive and terrifying. "You think my bow a toy," Eros said softly. "Let me demonstrate its power, O great slayer of serpents." Eros drew both arrows. The golden one he shot at Apollo with perfect accuracy. It struck the sun god in the chest, piercing through divine flesh to embed itself in his heart. The lead one he shot at Daphne, a beautiful river nymph, daughter of the river god Peneus, who happened to be walking through the forest at that moment, completely unaware she was about to become the centerpiece of a divine tragedy. Apollo, the moment the golden arrow pierced him, fell instantly madly, obsessively in love with the next being he saw. That being happened to be Daphne, who was hunting in the forest. She was lovely, yes, with the natural beauty common to nymphs, but that's not what drove Apollo's sudden passion. It was the magic of the golden arrow, turning his vision into a tunnel with her at the end of it, making her the single most important thing in his existence. Everything else, his recent victory, his new oracle, his divine duties, all of it faded to insignificance compared to the overwhelming need to possess her, to be with her, to make her love him in return. Daphne, for her part, had just been struck by the lead arrow. She was devoted to Artemis, Apollo's own twin sister, and had vowed to remain virginal like the goddess she served, to live a life devoted to hunting and nature, free from the complications of romantic or physical love. Now, thanks to Eros's interference, she found the very idea of romantic or physical love repulsive. When Apollo approached her with declarations of his divine love, his status, his power, she felt only revulsion and fear. She ran. Of course she ran. Apollo pursued. He called out to her as he chased, trying to persuade her with words even as his legs ate up the ground between them. His words tumbled out in a desperate stream, losing coherence as passion overwhelmed rationality. "I am not some peasant," he shouted after her. "I am Apollo. I am the son of Zeus. I killed Python. I rule Delphi. I know medicine. I can heal you if you are hurt. I know prophecy. I can tell your future. I can make you immortal. I can give you anything you desire. Please, just stop running. Just let me explain. Just give me a chance." But Daphne knew, with the certainty granted by Eros's lead arrow, that she would rather die than submit to Apollo's advances. She ran faster, her hair streaming behind her like a banner, her legs pumping desperately. Her heart hammered in her chest, her lungs burned. She could hear Apollo behind her, his footsteps impossibly close, his voice calling her name again and again. Apollo, god of athletics and forever young, easily could have caught her. His divine speed surpassed anything a nymph could manage. But he didn't want to simply overtake her. He wanted her to choose him, to turn and embrace him willingly. So he maintained his distance, close enough to terrify her into running faster, close enough that she could hear his breathing, but not close enough to actually grab her. He thought, in his arrow-addled mind, that if he just explained properly, if he just listed all his accomplishments and attributes, she would understand what an honor it was to be desired by him and stop running. Until she ran out of strength. Her legs trembled. Her vision blurred. She stumbled over a root and nearly fell. She felt Apollo's hand reaching for her shoulder, felt the warmth of his divine presence close behind her. In that moment of desperation, knowing she had no more strength to run, she screamed a prayer to her father Peneus. "Father, help me. If you have any power over the waters and the earth, change me, transform me into something he cannot desire. Take away this form, make me anything but what I am." Peneus heard his daughter's plea. The transformation began instantly. Daphne felt her feet growing roots, pushing down into the soil with sudden force that should have been painful, but felt more like relief. Her legs merged and hardened into a trunk. Her arms stretched out and became branches, reaching toward the sky as if in a final gesture of freedom. Her hair transformed into leaves, rustling in a breeze that suddenly seemed to whisper her name. Her smooth skin roughened into bark, gray and protective. And just as Apollo's fingers touched her shoulder, she completed her transformation into a laurel tree. Apollo, devastated, stumbled to a halt. His hand rested on bark where moments before had been soft skin. He could feel through the wood, the faint pulse of her heart still beating, now the heart of a tree rather than a nymph. He pressed his face against the bark and wept, divine tears falling onto the roots of the tree that had been the object of his obsession. "If you cannot be my bride," he said through his tears, "then you will be my tree. I will wear your leaves as my crown. You will be my symbol, sacred to me forever. Every victor will wear you. Every great achievement will be crowned with your branches. And I will ensure that your leaves remain forever green, that you will never decay, never wither, never die. You escaped me in body, but in memory, in symbol, you will be mine always." And from that day forward, Apollo wore a laurel wreath, and laurel leaves crowned victors in his honor at the Pythian Games and elsewhere throughout Greece. Athletes who triumphed wore Daphne on their heads. Poets crowned with laurel claimed her as their inspiration. Apollo's temples featured laurel trees in their groves. She had escaped him, yes, but in escaping had become even more permanently tied to him than marriage would have made her. The Greeks didn't see this as a romantic story. They saw it as a tragedy, a warning about the dangers of obsessive desire unchecked by reason. Apollo, god of rationality and order, had been reduced to a desperate pursuer, unable to take no for an answer. Daphne had been forced to sacrifice her very humanity to escape unwanted attention. Nobody won. Love, or rather its twisted shadow, had destroyed both of them in different ways. And Daphne's story was only the beginning of Apollo's romantic disasters. His next great love would die by his own sister's arrow. The one after that would be cursed to speak truths nobody believed. And the young man he loved most dearly would be accidentally killed during a friendly game, transformed into a flower as a memorial of their affection. Hyacinthus was a Spartan prince, beautiful beyond measure, the kind of youth that made even gods stop and stare. Apollo loved him, not with the obsessive madness of the golden arrow, but with genuine affection. They spent their days together, training, hunting, talking about philosophy and poetry. It was by most accounts the happiest Apollo ever was in matters of the heart. One warm afternoon they decided to practice athletics. Apollo wanted to teach Hyacinthus the proper technique for throwing the discus, that flat circular stone that Greek athletes hurled for distance and precision. They stripped off their excess clothing, oiled their bodies in the traditional athletic manner, and began their practice. Apollo threw first. The god's strength was tremendous, and the discus sailed through the sky like a bird, climbing higher and higher before beginning its inevitable descent. Hyacinthus, young and eager, and perhaps a bit competitive, ran to retrieve it, wanting to impress Apollo with his speed and athleticism. He didn't see the discus change its trajectory. What happened next has been blamed on various causes. Some say the wind god Zephyrus, who was also in love with Hyacinthus and jealous of Apollo's favor, blew the discus off course. Others claim it simply struck a rock and bounced at an unexpected angle. Still others whisper that it was fate, that some things are simply destined to occur, no matter how much gods might wish otherwise. The discus struck Hyacinthus in the head. The impact was catastrophic. Blood poured from the wound and the young prince collapsed instantly. Apollo rushed to him, calling upon all his healing powers, desperately trying to stem the bleeding, to reverse the damage. But even the god of medicine could not heal this injury. Sometimes the myths remind us, even gods are powerless against death when it comes. Hyacinthus died in Apollo's arms. The god wept, his tears falling onto the blood-soaked ground. And from that mixture of divine tears and mortal blood, a flower grew. The hyacinth, deep purple, with markings on its petals that some claimed formed the letters AI, the Greek cry of mourning. Though it should be noted that what the Greeks called a hyacinth was likely not the flower we know by that name today. Most scholars believe it was an iris, or perhaps a larkspur, flowers whose petal markings could more plausibly be seen as forming letters. Apollo could not bring Hyacinthus back. Zeus's law, established after Asclepius's execution, was clear on that point, but he ensured his beloved would be remembered. The hyacinth flower became sacred to Apollo, and an annual festival, the Hyacinthia, was celebrated in Sparta to honor the dead prince. Then there was Coronis, but we've already discussed her betrayal and death. The pattern, however, bears repeating. Apollo loved her. She was unfaithful. His response was to have her killed, then regret it too late, saving only their unborn child from the flames. His relationship seemed cursed to end in death or transformation. Cassandra, princess of Troy, represented a different kind of tragedy. Apollo, struck by her beauty and intelligence, pursued her with gifts rather than force. He offered her the gift of prophecy in exchange for her love. Cassandra accepted the gift, learning to see the future with clarity that few mortals ever possessed. But then, having gained the power, she refused Apollo's advances. A god cannot take back a gift once given. The divine powers don't work that way. So Apollo added a curse to his gift. Cassandra would see the future accurately. She would know what was coming, would understand the consequences of actions before they occurred. But no one would ever believe her prophecies. No one would listen. She would be dismissed as mad, ignored, ridiculed. She foresaw the fall of Troy. She warned against bringing the wooden horse into the city. She predicted Agamemnon's death upon his return from war. She knew she herself would die as a spoil of war. Every prophecy came true exactly as she said it would, and no one believed her until after the disasters had already occurred. Apollo's revenge was subtle but absolutely devastating. Cyparissus, another young man Apollo loved, died by his own request after accidentally killing a sacred deer that had been his companion. Grief-stricken beyond consoling, Cyparissus begged Apollo to let him mourn forever. Apollo, unable to refuse him, transformed the youth into a cypress tree, forever associated with mourning and graves. The pattern repeated throughout Apollo's mythological adventures. He fell in love. Something went wrong. The object of his affection died, was transformed or was cursed. He mourned, he moved on, and eventually he fell in love again. What does this tell us about Apollo? Perhaps that even gods cannot escape the fundamental truth that love makes us vulnerable. Or perhaps that the same intense focus that made Apollo excel at everything else, the same drive for perfection, became toxic when applied to relationships. He loved too much, too intensely, with too little regard for the agency and wishes of those he desired. The Greeks, watching these myths unfold in their poetry and drama, saw reflections of their own romantic disasters. If even a god as perfect as Apollo could not maintain successful relationships, what hope did ordinary mortals have? Love, the myth suggested, was always complicated, often tragic, and rarely ended the way one hoped. The Trojan War, that decade-long siege that consumed a generation of heroes, saw Apollo firmly planted on Troy's side against the Greeks. His reasons were multiple, his involvement consequential, and his actions would determine the fates of the war's greatest warriors. We've already discussed how the war began, at least for Apollo's direct involvement, with the plague sent against the Greeks for dishonoring his priest Chryses. But Apollo's support for Troy ran deeper than that single incident. Aphrodite, goddess of love and beauty, was his half-sister, and she favored the Trojans because of Paris's judgment that had sparked the war. Apollo, in turn, supported his sister's choice. More personally, Apollo had reasons to resent at least some of the Greeks. Agamemnon's disrespect toward Chryses was only the latest in a long line of mortal arrogance, and Achilles, the greatest of the Greek warriors, had killed Tennis, a son of Apollo, early in the war despite warnings not to do so. The sun god had scores to settle. Throughout the Iliad, Apollo intervenes on Troy's behalf repeatedly. When Hector, Troy's greatest warrior, is wounded by Ajax's stone throw, Apollo himself comes down from Olympus and breathes fresh strength into him. Hector rises, renewed, and drives the Greeks back to their ships. When the Trojans are on the verge of burning the Greek fleet, only Patroclus' intervention in Achilles' armor stops them, and even then, it's Apollo who ultimately ensures Patroclus' death. The killing of Patroclus deserves particular attention, because it shows Apollo's direct, brutal involvement in mortal combat. Patroclus, wearing Achilles' armor and fighting with all the fury of his friend's renowned skill, had driven the Trojans back to their walls. He was unstoppable, or seemed to be. 3 times he charged the walls of Troy itself. 3 times Apollo personally pushed him back, warning him that it was not fated for Troy to fall to him. But Patroclus, drunk on battle fury and success, did not listen to the god's warnings. So Apollo acted. He struck Patroclus from behind, a divine blow that stunned him. The impact knocked Achilles' helmet from Patroclus' head, shattered his spear, tore away his shield. In that moment of vulnerable confusion, Euphorbus, a Trojan warrior, stabbed Patroclus with his spear. And then Hector, seeing his opportunity, delivered the killing blow. Patroclus died, but not before recognizing Apollo's hand in his fate. "The god and Hector have killed me," he gasped with his dying breath, understanding that his death had been orchestrated by forces beyond the mortal battlefield. This death accomplished what nothing else could. It brought Achilles back into the war. Achilles, who had been sulking in his tent, refusing to fight because of his quarrel with Agamemnon, exploded in grief and rage. He demanded new armor from Hephaestus, received weapons and shield crafted by the divine smith himself, and returned to battle with the singular purpose of killing Hector. Apollo protected Hector as long as he could. When Achilles cut through the Trojan forces like a scythe through wheat, Apollo shielded Hector, wrapping him in mist to hide him from his pursuer. When that failed, Apollo disguised himself as a Trojan prince, Agenor, and dueled Achilles personally to buy time for the Trojan army to retreat behind their walls. But fate is fate. Even gods must eventually bow to it. The day came when Hector stood alone outside Troy's walls to face Achilles. Apollo withdrew his protection. He could delay the inevitable, but not prevent it. Achilles killed Hector, as prophecy had always said he would. Yet Apollo's revenge against Achilles was still to come. The sun god had not forgotten Achilles' crimes against his sons and priests. He knew Achilles' secret, the vulnerability that his mother, Thetis's attempt to make him invulnerable, had created. When Achilles was killed near the end of the war, shot by Paris's arrow, it was Apollo who guided that arrow to Achilles' heel, the one spot where the great warrior could be harmed. Different versions of the story place this death in different contexts. Some say Achilles was simply fighting near the Scaean gates when Paris shot him. Others claim he was inside Troy's temple of Apollo, having come to discuss marriage with Priam about Polyxena, Hector's sister, and that Paris ambushed him there, shooting him in Apollo's own sanctuary. Still others suggest Achilles was scaling Troy's walls when the arrow found him. What all versions agree on is Apollo's involvement. The god who could shoot with perfect accuracy, who had killed Python with 1,000 arrows, who never missed, guided Paris's arrow to its target. Achilles, who had survived 10 years of brutal combat, who had fought and killed countless Trojans, including Hector himself, died from a single arrow to his vulnerable heel. This was divine justice, Apollo style. Not immediate, not obvious, but absolutely certain. Achilles had offended Apollo through hubris and carelessness. The god waited, patient as only immortals can be patient, and struck when the moment was right. The greatest Greek warrior died by the will of the god he had slighted. Throughout the Trojan War, Apollo proved himself a major player in divine politics. He clashed with his sister Athena, who favored the Greeks. He cooperated with Ares, who simply enjoyed war regardless of which side was winning. He acted as both protector and destroyer, savior and executioner. His role in the war reminds us that the gods, for all their power, were subject to their own limitations. They could influence fate, but not change it. They could delay the inevitable, but not prevent it. Troy was always doomed to fall, and Apollo knew this even as he fought to save it. When Troy finally fell, when the wooden horse had done its work and the city burned, Apollo's protection was withdrawn. His temples were desecrated, his priests killed, his people enslaved or slaughtered. The god who had fought so hard to save Troy could only watch as prophecy fulfilled itself. Perhaps that's the real tragedy of Apollo in the Trojan War. Not that he chose the losing side, but that he knew he was on the losing side from the beginning and fought anyway. To understand Apollo fully, one must understand his symbols, for the ancient Greeks communicated complex ideas through visual and physical representations. Apollo's symbols were many, each carrying layers of meaning. The silver bow came first, always. It was his weapon, yes, but also his instrument of divine will. The arrows that flew from it could bring plague or healing, death to the guilty or protection to the faithful. The bow represented distance, both physical and metaphorical, Apollo's ability to affect the world from Olympus without descending into mortal chaos. The lyre, of course, was his musical symbol, the instrument that allowed him to create harmony from chaos. It represented civilization, the arts, the refinement of human culture beyond mere survival. When Apollo played, he reminded mortals that life was more than eating and fighting and reproducing. There was beauty, there was music, there was transcendence through art. The laurel wreath crowned his head eternally, a reminder of Daphne and a symbol of victory. Laurel wreaths were awarded to winners at the Pythian Games and other competitions. They represented achievement, triumph, but also carried the bittersweet memory of love transformed into symbol. His sacred animals included swans, who pulled his chariot and represented grace and beauty. Ravens and crows, despite their cursed black feathers, remained associated with him, serving as messengers and symbols of prophecy. Wolves acknowledged his northern connections, his time among the Hyperboreans, that mysterious land of eternal spring where he supposedly spent the winter months. Dolphins connected him to the sea and to Delphi itself, for he had taken the form of a dolphin when transporting the Cretan priests who would serve his oracle. Delos, his birthplace, remained sacred to him throughout antiquity. The island became one of the most important religious centers in Greece. Pilgrims came from across the Mediterranean to honor Apollo at his birthplace. Temples rose, monuments accumulated. The ancient Greeks understood that places held power, that the site of a god's birth carried divine resonance. But Delphi overshadowed even Delos. The Oracle of Delphi was not just Apollo's religious center, it was the religious center of Greek civilization. City-states consulted it before founding colonies. Kings sought its guidance before going to war. Individuals came seeking answers about their personal futures. The priests who interpreted the Pythia's ravings wielded enormous soft power, essentially able to shape policy across the Greek world through strategic interpretation of divine prophecy. Other sacred sites existed across Greece and beyond. At Delos, at Didyma in Asia Minor, at Claros, oracular sites dedicated to Apollo provided prophecy and guidance. At Epidaurus, his son Asclepius's healing sanctuary combined Apollo's healing aspect with practical medicine. The god's reach extended from the temples of Greece to Rome, where he was adopted with particular enthusiasm during the reign of Augustus, who claimed special connection to Apollo. His children carried his legacy forward in myth and in cultural impact. Asclepius became the foundation of medical practice. Orpheus, according to some traditions, Apollo's son through the muse Calliope, became the greatest musician who ever lived, able to charm stones and trees with his lyre. Various other children, daughters who became priestesses, sons who became poets or warriors, spread Apollo's influence throughout the mythological landscape. Through them, and through his direct worship, Apollo became essential to Greek identity. He represented the highest ideals of Greek civilization: physical perfection, artistic achievement, rational thought, prophetic wisdom. He was Kalokagathia embodied, the perfect fusion of beauty and virtue that the Greeks aspired to achieve. Yet even in his perfection, even in his symbolic representation of ideals, Apollo remained deeply, fundamentally flawed. And perhaps that's what made him so important to the Greeks. He wasn't an untouchable deity, dwelling in absolute perfection. He was complex, contradictory, capable of both sublime beauty and terrible cruelty. He could heal or harm. He could inspire art or destroy the artist who dared compete with him. He could love passionately and cause nothing but tragedy. Here then is the central question about Apollo. How do we reconcile these contradictions? How can the god of reason be driven to irrational pursuit of a nymph? How can the god of healing send plagues? How can the patron of civilization flay a satyr for the crime of musical competition? The answer, perhaps, is that Apollo embodies the contradictions inherent in civilization itself. The Greeks understood that civilization was not the absence of violence and chaos, but rather the controlled channeling of those forces. Music required both passion and discipline. Medicine required the ability to cut as well as to heal. Prophecy required seeing darkness as well as light. Apollo, with his silver bow and golden lyre, his healing touch and deadly arrows, his gifts of prophecy and curses of truth unbelieved, represented the full spectrum of what it meant to be civilized. He was not safe. The Greeks never wanted their gods to be safe. They wanted them to be powerful, effective, capable of affecting the world. Safety was for the powerless. Consider his role as god of prophecy. He spoke the future through his oracle, but those futures were often terrible, and the warnings frequently misunderstood. Oedipus received prophecy and spent his life trying to avoid it, only to fulfill it precisely. Croesus consulted Delphi and heard that if he went to war, a great kingdom would fall, not understanding that the kingdom in question would be his own. Apollo's gift of prophecy was real, but it came with no guarantee that knowing the future would allow you to change it. Or consider his relationship with music and poetry. He led the muses, yes, but he also killed competitors. The contradiction here is that art requires both inspiration and standards. Apollo inspired beauty while ruthlessly defending certain boundaries. Perhaps the Greeks saw in this a truth about artistic excellence, that it required discipline and judgment as much as creative freedom. In his healing and plague sending, Apollo reflected the ancient understanding that disease and health were not opposites, but related manifestations of the same natural forces. The god who could cure could also cause because health and illness emerged from the same divine source. This wasn't a contradiction to the Greeks. It was obvious truth. The physician who understood healing necessarily understood harm. Even his love affairs, tragic as they were, spoke to something the Greeks observed about desire and possession. The more passionately Apollo loved, the more destructive that love became. Daphne transformed herself to escape him. Hyacinthus died in a sporting accident. Coronis was executed for infidelity. The message seemed clear. Love, especially obsessive love, especially love from a vastly more powerful being, was dangerous. It could not be controlled or predicted, even by the god of reason himself. Apollo's youth, his eternal representation as a beardless young man, might be the key to understanding him. He was forever in that liminal space between adolescence and full adulthood, old enough to possess power, but young enough to use it impulsively. He had the weapons of maturity, but not always the wisdom. This made him relatable to the Greeks in a way that older, more settled gods like Poseidon or Hades were not. The sun, often associated with Apollo, particularly in later Greek and Roman tradition, provided another layer of symbolism. The sun gives life. Plants require it. Warmth depends on it, yet it can also scorch and kill. Too much sun creates desert. The right amount creates paradise. Apollo, like the sun, had to be appreciated, but also approached with caution and respect. So we return now to where we began, to Apollo in all his radiant, complicated glory, God of so many things, God of contradictions, God who represented the highest ideals of Greek civilization while embodying so many of its tensions and conflicts. From the moment of his birth on Delos, emerging fully formed and declaring his domains, Apollo was different. He didn't grow into his power, he possessed it from the beginning. According to various traditions, while still extraordinarily young, he slew Python. He acquired the lyre through his infant half-brother's mischief. He established the most important oracle in the Greek world. He became the gold standard for music, the arbitrator of athletic and artistic achievement, the voice of prophecy, the source of healing. But he also left a trail of tragedy in his wake. Lovers transformed or killed, competitors flayed alive or cursed, entire armies struck down by plague, cities defended but ultimately doomed. For all his beauty and power, Apollo could not escape the fundamental truth that power without perfect wisdom creates suffering. The ancient Greeks worshipped him anyway. They built temples that took decades to complete. They traveled across dangerous seas to consult his oracle. They crowned their victors with his sacred laurel. They called upon him in sickness and in health, in war and in peace, in creation and in destruction. They understood in a way we sometimes forget that perfection doesn't mean without flaw. It means the perfect expression of what something is meant to be. And Apollo was perfectly what a god should be: powerful, beautiful, terrible, inspiring, deadly, and capable of changing the world with a word, an arrow, or a note from his lyre. His myths continue to resonate because they speak to eternal human experiences: the pain of unrequited love, the danger of hubris, the complexity of trying to do good while possessing the power to do harm, the recognition that knowing the future doesn't mean you can change it, the understanding that healing and harming are sometimes inseparable aspects of the same act. When we look at Apollo, we see reflected back at us our own aspirations and failures. We want to be beautiful, talented, wise, powerful. We want to heal and inspire and create beauty in the world. But we also know, if we're honest, that those same drives can lead us to hurt others, to act thoughtlessly, to leave tragedy in our wake even when we meant well. Perhaps that's why the ancient Greeks needed Apollo. Not because he was perfect, but because he showed them that even perfection was flawed, that even the gods struggled with the same fundamental problems that plagued mortals. Love was complicated for everyone. Art demanded sacrifice from everyone. Power came with responsibility that everyone sometimes failed to uphold. The temples to Apollo are ruins now, scattered across Greece and Asia Minor and Italy. The Oracle at Delphi fell silent centuries ago. The Pythian games ended. But the stories remain. The archer god with his silver bow, the musician with his golden lyre, the prophet who spoke truth through riddles, the healer who could harm, the beautiful youth whose loves all ended in sorrow. These stories survived because they contain truths that transcend their ancient origins. They remind us that contradictions don't cancel each other out. They coexist. That light casts shadows. That every gift comes with cost. That civilization is not the absence of wildness, but its channeling into productive forms. That prophecy is burden as often as blessing. That love, especially from the powerful toward the powerless, must be tempered with wisdom and restraint, or it becomes predation. If you've made it this far on our journey through Apollo's myths, thank you for your patience and attention. These ancient stories deserve careful consideration, and I appreciate you taking the time to listen. If you enjoyed this exploration of the sun god, the far shooter, the god of the silver bow and golden lyre, please do give this video a like. Subscribe if you want more deep dives into mythology and ancient history. Let me know in the comments which aspect of Apollo's mythology resonated most with you, or which god or hero you'd like to explore next. The fire has burned low now. Dawn is not far off, and somewhere above us, perhaps Apollo himself rides his chariot across the sky, bringing light to the world, his laurel wreath gleaming, his lyre silent for the moment, his silver bow at rest. The day begins with him, and perhaps that's fitting. For all his flaws, all his tragedies, all his contradictions, Apollo remains the god of light, the one who dispels darkness, who brings clarity even when that clarity is uncomfortable, who reminds us that truth matters, art matters, beauty matters, even when pursuing them costs us dearly. Sleep well, friends, and may you dream of divine music, of prophecies that guide rather than curse, of healing without harm, and of loves that don't require transformation to escape. Until next time, this has been your guide through the myths and legends of the ancient world. Good night.